I just want to tell you how absolutely privileged I am and honored to be here today. And particularly in front of all my Atlanta friends. I think we've emptied the Atlanta group and we've brought all of the Atlanta Mafia together, and so I appreciate that. So the title of my talk today is How to Harness History Without Crawling Up on a High Horse. And I hope by the end of this talk you don't think I'm on a high horse, okay? If you think so, you let me know, please. So let's think differently and think about an interesting time in American history. It was a time when people retreated into echo chambers in which everyone agreed with one another and completely ignored others' perspectives, where different groups of people were reading the same information and coming out with the exact opposite conclusions, and were each fully convinced of their intellectual purity, insisting on canceling opinions that didn't align with their own. Does that sound familiar? Well, of course, I'm talking about America in the 1930s. Imagine the year is 1936. You find yourself in Atlanta, Georgia, a bustling and fast-growing city in the heart of the southeastern United States. It's far from harmonious. Racial segregation is the law. The South is still reeling from its impacts of the country's most deadly war, the Civil War. Economically, the South is like a colony within the larger nation. 2 years later, President Roosevelt would famously refer to the region as the #1 economic problem in the country, a line he would repeat several times. But back to 1936, Atlanta is also reeling from the effects of the massive upheavals of the 20th century, a race massacre in 1906, the Great War, boll weevil, Prohibition, the Spanish flu, and the Great Depression. Here in the city, you will find two literary luminaries whose works were published only 7 months apart. Margaret Mitchell, author of Gone with the Wind, and W.B. Du Bois, author of Black Reconstruction in America, an essay toward a history of the part which black folk played in the attempt to reconstruct American democracy, 1860 to 1880. Now, on the surface, it might seem that these two works and these two individuals have little in common. But the way they both interacted with a common city, Atlanta, and the wide-ranging impact their works are going to have, albeit in much different ways, illustrate the importance of studying history with all of its challenging nuance. Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind was her first and only novel. The book painted a romantic, melodramatic picture of the Civil War and its aftermath, told from the perspective of a white planter family. Upon the book's release in 1936, New Republic critic Malcolm Cowley famously called it, quote, an encyclopedia of the plantation legend, with all of its episodes and all of its characters and all of its stage settings, with the war between the states, sir, and the twins riding off on their fiery chargers, and the lovely lady staying behind to nurse the wounded, and Sherman's march. Then the black days of Reconstruction, the callousness of the carpetbaggers, the scallywaggishness of the scallywags, the knightliness of the Ku Klux Klan, who's making Georgia safe for democracy, and our virtuous womanhood, and our Jean Talmadge. It's all here, every last bale of cotton and bushel of moonlight, every last full measure of Southern female devotion, working its lily-white fingers to its lily-white bone. Now, that plantation legend is also known as the Lost Cause. It's worth noting that the book was not without criticism at publication, and such criticism mounted with the movie adaptation. Many, in the black press in particular, noted the book's inaccurate portrayal of history, such as the myth of the happy slave. But the criticism had no effect on its massive success. W.B. Du Bois, on the other hand, was already a successful writer, activist, and academic. Perhaps best known today for his earlier work, The Souls of Black Folk, written in 1903 during his first stint in Atlanta. Black Reconstruction was a carefully researched academic book written with the explicit intention of setting the record straight when it came to inaccurate understandings of the Civil War and Reconstruction. At that time, many white historians blamed black Americans for the so-called failure of Reconstruction. They insisted that white Southerners had been mistreated following the war and either minimized or outright denied the role of slavery in causing the conflict. These historians also insisted that black Americans were not intelligent enough to govern. These viewpoints were widely held, especially by historian and New Jersey native William Archibald Dunning of Columbia University. Du Bois was having none of it. He was on the forefront of analyzing his biases and fallacies in all of these arguments. In the introduction to Black Reconstruction, Du Bois wrote that this book was going to take a novel approach to Reconstruction history and assumed that, quote, the Negro in America and in general is an average and ordinary human being who under a given environment develops like other human beings. As Du Bois's dry comment suggests, this was not a viewpoint that he could assume his readers would necessarily hold in the 1930s. Looking more closely at the context and environment of 1930s America, and specifically 1930s Atlanta, Mitchell and Du Bois both produced works that reflected their starkly different identities and experiences, again, just 7 months apart. Du Bois was almost twice Mitchell's age. He was 67 when Black Reconstruction came out in 1935. Mitchell was 35 when Gone with the Wind came out in 1936. Du Bois was highly educated, becoming the first person to earn a PhD from Harvard after previously studying at Fisk and Harvard for his undergraduate education. He followed up this impressive academic record with postdoctoral research in Germany. Mitchell, on the other hand, completed 1 year at Smith College before coming back to Atlanta after the unexpected death of her mother. She never again pursued higher education, but instead became a feature writer and reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Sunday magazine. They wrote from the opposite sides of the color line. Mitchell is a white woman, Du Bois is a black man. They did share a common city, Atlanta. Du Bois spent 23 of his 95 years in Atlanta, while Mitchell spent all but one of her 49 years in the city. Du Bois, when he wasn't in Atlanta, lived all over from New York to Ghana, where he died in 1963 on the day before the March on Washington. Although Gone with the Wind and Black Reconstruction shared similar subject matter, how Mitchell and Du Bois approached that subject matter and how their books were received was radically different. Gone with the Wind has been astronomically popular with generations of readers. In its first 6 months, it sold 1 million copies and has been translated into dozens of languages. Many people lauded it as being historically accurate, a charge that was deeply important to Mitchell herself. She took great pride in her research, which used sources popular with mainstream white historians at the time. Readers found her Atlanta to be so compelling, they often traveled the city and searched for her characters and locations of characters in the book. Through her research, Mitchell asserted that although the characters were not real people, the events experienced by them came from real-life accounts of the war. So what we did is we sent an intrepid researcher for the task of reading all 33 memoirs, Civil War memoirs, in Margaret Mitchell's library. And we found actually many of the events of Gone with the Wind in those, including when Atlanta was burning with the horse that was leaving the city. That's directly lifted out of a so-called memoir. On the other hand, Black Reconstruction wasn't so stunningly successful. Black scholars and critics heralded Black Reconstruction as revolutionary due to its contradiction of commonly accepted explanations for the failure of Reconstruction. Through historical analysis of sources like government records, some of these records were the same that Dunning and his followers used as the basis of their research, but Du Bois was able to analyze them without a bias against black people. With Black Reconstruction, as one thrilled black critic wrote, Dr. Du Bois has produced a great work. Only the most surly blindness can attempt to write again of Reconstruction in America without taking into account the point of view here presented. Eleanor Roosevelt read it and tried to get her husband to read it. We don't know if she succeeded. Even so, a significant portion of the white establishment downplayed or ignored Du Bois's work. One of the best things about his book, if you look, he has the best bibliography I've ever seen. It rates all of his sources by their bias against black people, and it's hilarious. So go to your Black Reconstruction and look up their bibliography. But today, the tables have turned. Gone with the Wind is still famous, but is a fraught piece of pop culture. Black Reconstruction, on the other hand, has become the basis of much of Reconstruction scholarship. My hometown of Atlanta provided vastly different experiences for these two people, as different as Margaret Mitchell and Du Bois. Yet they lived only 4 miles apart and somehow found rich social and intellectual environments in which to flourish. That inherent contradiction is what makes history so fascinating. When we mentioned the story of Mitchell and Du Bois and mused on what a meetup would like between the two, Du Bois' Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer, David Levering Lewis, called the notion historian's catnip. Still looking for a playwright for that. These types of stories illustrate the importance of history. Studying history helps us understand the context that surround people's lives and how that might have impacted what they were able to do or not do in their lifetimes. We can't just limit ourselves to studying, though. We have to ensure that people actually hear what we have to say, and that is an entirely different matter. I don't have to tell you that 2025 is an interesting time to run a history museum. And last week, President Trump's attack on the Smithsonian made it damn interesting. Candidly, it's always been interesting to run a history museum. As historical novelist E.L. Doctorow once said, history is at all times hot. Studying the past isn't just about the past. It's about how we interpret the past and what that interpretation reveals about our present day. Okay, that's borderline philosophical, and that may be appropriate for this place, but I'm going to fall back on my legal training. Let me put it another way. The evidence is the evidence. How we interpret the evidence depends on where you sit. That matters because the outside world affects how people engage with history. It also affects how useful history can be in helping us to understand and situate our present. And at the under end of the spectrum, it affects how history can be used or even weaponized against different points of view. Back in 2017, I attended a week-long symposium for museum leaders and key programmatic staff at Yale University, led by famed historian David Blight. It was a stimulating week, focused on handling difficult history in polarized times, which actually seems quite quaint in retrospect. Something was bothering me about these discussions, though. There seemed to be resistance towards any action or interpretation that could be seen as, to use a word that was in vogue at the time, privileging people in the majority. In one of these sections, I asked fellow attendees, which should have been an easy question, do you want people coming to your museum with whom you disagree? The response was silence. The silence was deafening. I find museums valuable because they allow us the opportunity to confront the real stuff, face-to-face, and to encounter viewpoints and ideas that may be different from our own. But it became clear to me that what some desired in the museum field was not engagement with the broad public. A broad public, after all, might come in with opinions and thoughts that are contrary to the facts of history, or the facts of history as museum staff defined them. What many in the field seemed to want was to be validated for their work and viewpoints by their audience, rather than being challenged by them. I get it, it's very human, but it's also not what a field rooted in education needs to hold as a core value. I've always lived by the motto that you can either signal that you are going to be right, or you can actually be effective in what you're trying to say. As an institution, we should strive to be effective in delivering new information, surprising insights, and useful interpretation that helps our audience develop awareness of new and different perspectives. You can't approach a visitor with the stated goal of attempting to change their mind. If anything, trying too obviously to do so makes them shut down and not listen to anything you have to say. None of that means that we compromise on the facts. All it means is we use certain tactics to make the facts able to be heard by multiple audiences. Being a museum located in the southern United States that has the largest Civil War collection under one roof in the country, has the Battle of Atlanta cyclorama, owns the house where Margaret Mitchell wrote Gone with the Wind, and resides in the shadow of the world's largest Confederate monument at Stone Mountain Park, we deal with a lot of history that people might consider difficult or negative. Public awareness has come a long way in recognizing the core cause of the Civil War. Now, over the institution of slavery, right? Now, only 44% of Americans believe that the Civil War was fought over states' rights and not slavery. You can find stacks of crank letters in our institutional archives from the 1990s from Sons of Confederate veterans complaining that we invited that Yankee Ken Burns down to show his documentary. Of course, the irony today is that some left-leaning intellectuals now view his documentary as too pro-Confederate. We have to remember the large number of visitors who still walk in with these views, crying out states' rights or tariffs. Tariffs. They're back. It's tempting to look with exasperation with visitors who still buy the lost cause narrative. There are many visitors who don't hold a view at all about the Civil War. They simply don't know much about the most important conflict and consequential one in United States history. After so many years and so much scholarship, how could they possibly not know or be unaware? That's where a large dose of humility and recognition of the actual process of how history gets translated becomes a useful antidote. The largest artifact we have at the Atlanta History Center is the Battle of Atlanta cyclorama painting. Completed in 1886, it's one of only two examples remaining in the United States of a popular art form, entertainment form in the late 19th century. Cyclorama paintings were made of a standard saws nearly 400 feet around and 50 feet tall, and show dramatic scenes of war and devastation to cinematic-like 3D entertainment. Cycloramas fell out of favor when motion pictures came on the scene. Prior to that, though, you could find dozens of them traveling all across the country. Today, it's just Atlanta and Gettysburg. Our cyclorama was painted in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1886 for northern audiences. After all, the Battle of Atlanta was a clear United States victory, and that's during the Civil War. The victory and subsequent surrender of Atlanta was so important that it encouraged naysayers to abandon the idea of a negotiated peace with the Confederacy and give President Abraham Lincoln a second term to end the war with a clear military victory. Atlanta influences everything. Just imagine how different these United States would be if the Confederacy had been allowed to persist through a negotiated peace. My favorite counterfactual is from H.L. Mencken, who in the Sahara of the Beaux-Arts declared, "Richmond would be not the dull suburb of nothing that it is now, but a beautiful and consoling second-rate capital comparable to Budapest, Brussels, Stockholm, or The Hague." And yet, given all that, when the cyclorama ended up in Atlanta, it received a different treatment. The only Confederate victory ever painted, an advertisement in the Atlanta Constitution said. The year was 1892. There were many people there who had remembered the crushing defeat personally because they'd lived through it. Did they actually think the Battle of Atlanta was a Confederate victory? Hard to say, probably not a military victory, but in the painting, they were able to find justification for the pernicious viewpoint of what we call the lost cause. Think about it. The action in the painting features a moment where the Confederacy briefly broke through the U.S. lines and put the outcome of the day into question. Then Union General Blackjack Logan led the cavalry counterattack, forces the Confederates back, reinforced the lines, and ultimately won the battle. But for a former Confederate, here's how they could see it. Look at this moment where we clearly showed our military prowess against overwhelming odds. The South was so close to winning this crucial battle, but had to fall back based on the sheer number of Yankee invaders and their pesky, newfangled, repeating rifles. We fought valiantly for our fireside and families. A numbers game doesn't prove anything about the justness of our cause or the bravery of our soldiers. See how it works? So the only Confederate victory ever painted, for a significant portion of white Atlantans, that's what it meant to them. It also illustrates how you get the two Atlantans that produced Margaret Mitchell and W.B. Du Bois. Margaret Mitchell's grandparents were former Confederates. She grew up hearing stories of the war from their point of view, even remarking that she didn't know that the South had lost until she was 10 years old. Du Bois, of course, had no such illusions. The Atlanta he experienced as a young man in his first teaching stint at Atlanta University in the early 1900s was one that showcased black talent and opportunity in the face of adversity. It also laid bare the most hateful realities of Jim Crow America, especially when he witnessed the 1906 race massacre. They were in the same city, but their experiences, the people they knew, the side of the color line they were on, all meant they lived in different realities. When we talk about segregation today, we often focus on separate water fountains and bus seats. I don't think we often think enough about the profound impact on American thought. Reared in a world in which separate could allegedly be equal, many white people, including many in the North, thought of a whole race of people as basically a different species. It's hard to put into words the way that would shape the viewpoint of someone born into that world. It showed up in everything, including racial jokes that were cocktail currency, while actually serving to underpin the ideological basis of Jim Crow. Thankfully, there were some people throughout the South and the rest of the country that could see outside their own constraints. There were also talented, dedicated organizers and thinkers who engineered movements to help even more people recognize there could be a different way to live. Of course, black people were never confused. The cyclorama remained a public attraction through all of these changes. After the film of Gone with the Wind became a hit sensation, the welcome music to the experience was changed, of course, to Tara's theme. The cyclorama, Confederacy, the Civil War, all were looked at by many white people, both in and outside the South, with reverence, nostalgia, and the feeling that the Old South represented a better time. This was the ideology of the lost cause, and it was persistent, powerful, and nationwide. The hold on the lost cause on thoughts about the Civil War seeped into the school curricula, both deliberately through the efforts of people like the United Daughters of Confederacy and by osmosis. It tinged popular culture in movies, books, and television. The lost cause was, and still is, earnestly believed by many people, despite historical evidence to the contrary. But again, a lot of historical interpretation isn't really about the past, it's about the present. During the decades of immense change of the 20th century, an incomplete national recovery from cataclysmic conflicts, including the World Wars, the Great Depression, Depression, tremendous social and political upheaval driven by the civil rights movements and the Vietnam War, it makes sense that some were trying to hold on to an idealized version of the past rather than confront the more complicated present. Now, this pining for a supposedly better past is right at home in our current moment, as evidenced by President Trump's March 27 executive order entitled Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History. Among other things, the order calls out attempts to, quote, undermine the remarkable achievements of the United States by casting milestones in so-called negative light. It makes liberal use of the words greatness and great, defining sites dedicated to history as one that should be solemn and uplifting public monuments that remind Americans of our extraordinary heritage, rather than present so-called devices narratives. Now, footnote, I define heritage as history with all the bad parts left out. This is the context our visitors come in with every day. Today, we present the cyclorama as a story of historical memory. That's a story of how the painting's meaning changed over time and why it changed over time. The artifact itself is striking, a captivating experience that takes in even the most skeptical visitor. I spoke earlier about tactics for delivering facts. Effective tactics are those that can make someone pause and have a moment of receptiveness to new perspectives. Surprise is one such way, and humor is another. And for any of those to be effective, we have to present the history using uncharged and easily understood language. In the cyclorama exhibit, you'll find Clark Gable from Gone with the Wind fame. While in Atlanta during the movie's premiere in 1939, he visited the cyclorama with Margaret Mitchell, Vivian Leigh, and Olivia de Havilland, and is reported to have turned to Mayor Hartsfield to express that the only thing wrong with the painting is that he wasn't in it. Hartsfield delivered. Clark Gable's likeness was installed as a dead Yankee soldier in the diorama. That gag lives on to this day, in the process helping a visitor see the painting's relationship to popular culture in the 1930s. Surprise can also open up new possibilities for learning. How often in everyday life do we have the humility and ability to pause, think about something new, and say honestly, you know, I didn't know that. One day, shortly after the cyclorama was restored, I covertly followed a group of ladies from a South Georgia chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. On the way out, one of the ladies was clearly in distress, taking the vapor, she might say. Her friend tried to talk her off the ledge. Well, Marge, it actually was painted in Milwaukee. Anyway, that's the rationale behind our approach with the exhibition Cyclorama, the Big Picture. Simply put, we cannot follow our visitors out into the parking lot to make sure they learn something. We can't also berate them over questions about the causes and consequences of the Civil War, which would likely lead to either agreement from those who already agree or a shutdown from those who do not. In this case, we want to be right and effective, and I think we found to do that with this incredible artifact. This approach is illustrated through our guiding principles, a set of ideas the Atlanta History Center hold at the core of everything we do. Our Board of Trustees adopted these guiding principles in June of 2019. I want to present a few excerpts for you to consider. Atlanta History Center believes that history is an effective medium for bridging chasms. Artfully told and grounded in evidence, it can bring us together. History is also messy. Whether realized or not, it continuously influences our world by shaping our viewpoints and experiences. These qualities make history a touchstone for stimulating hard conversations and make cultural institutions, places that still retain a high degree of trust, an ideal place for doing it. We are living in a time of anger and flux. Rather than shy away, Atlanta History Center wants to seize the opportunity for change. Atlanta History Center believes in clear, thoughtful communication that will stimulate curiosity while being straightforward on the facts. We will not be neutral regarding well-documented historical conclusions that might be considered controversy in public square, i.e. slavery was caused Civil War. Through our presentation of difficult history, we do not seek to shame, label, or discourage visitors. Rather, we seek to engage with them through exhibitions, programming, and outreach, and encourage discussions that are empathetic, historically informed, and inclusive of all members of our community. I repeat, adopted in 2019. The headwinds were already there because history has shown us that the topics that matter the most have always been contentious to discuss. To respond to my colleagues from the Yale Symposium, by taking this approach, are we privileging white people or coddling conservatives because we're worried about offending them? No, we're not. We want to be able to reach them and everyone in a way that allows them to be receptive to the perspective we offer. I repeat, right and effective. Atlanta and the surrounding area is diverse and brings together people from all across the political spectrum. Our interpretation must realize this. Which brings me finally to the title of my talk, How to Harness History Without Crawling Up on a High Horse. I was inspired by the lyrical genius of the Southern rock and alternative country band, Drive-By Truckers from Athens, Georgia. I ain't gonna crawl up on no high horse because I got thrown off one when I was young and I ain't no cowboy. I've been waiting years to use that. You can't approach others about history from up on a high horse or you'll find yourself getting run off or thrown off very quickly. History should be harnessed, but it's both complex and complicated. We all bring things, both conscious and unconscious, into our interpretation of the past. I know I've been wrong about history. I know I'll be wrong about history again. What matters is the continuous effort to learn things one didn't know, see things one didn't see, and not repeat the same mistakes again. That same approach extends to our visitors. We aren't crawling up on our high horse because we know we've made mistakes, missed something important, or had blinders on when looking at the past. That's why we make our sources and research available and regularly question and re-question the information we're making available by showing our work. We hope that showing at least some humility will encourage visitors to meet us on a level playing field. We want people from all backgrounds and experiences to understand that they have an open invitation to our museum. Still, we have people in the national government today who are actively pushing back on attempts to even acknowledge that history is complicated. The charge is that telling the fuller story is somehow denying the greatness of America or making white people feel bad. That's the real issue. I'll be candid, this does not surprise me. In at least some respects, it connects back to the lack of response to my question at the Yale Conference 2017. For years, some in the museum profession field have been acting like they don't want people to come who hold different points of view, especially those who have conservative viewpoints. Other institutions that would be considered part of the elite have behaved in much the same way. Take, for example, the code of conduct of the official accreditation body for the museum field, the American Alliance of Museums, who accredits the Atlanta History Center. The code lays out in its definition of discrimination and harassment, some of which is very much in line with legal definitions of terms, but it goes further and declares in broad strokes what isn't harassment, such as being criticized for so-called social privilege. It also carves out special protection and exceptions based on a person's lived experience. However, lived experience is defined in a footnote as firsthand accounts and impressions of living as a member of a minority or oppressed group. So, if you meet the elusive definition of having social privilege, your life experiences don't count as a lived experience. As I walk around Chautauqua, I suspect many of us would not qualify as having an AAM lived experience. The code goes on to use buzzwords that signal being left-leaning, paired with obtuse grammar that makes the whole thing deliberately vague. I'll be frank. It's exactly this kind of behavior that has led to the professional trolling on the right, it's now engaging in on a daily basis. Rather than establishing helpful guidelines for maintaining an environment for learning and growth, guidelines such as these set out parameters for shutting down conversations when they don't align with certain ideological viewpoints. No one who already uses the AAM-approved terms like sexist and social privilege needs to be told to abide by code of conduct. It merely serves as a repellent to those not already in the tent. All an outsider would see are unclear definitions that are used to take away the opportunity for discourse and put unintentional terminology, snafus, on the same playing field as conduct motivated by real malice. By the way, I can say all of this because we were reaccredited last year for 10 years. It's precisely these types of documents and practices, like the policing of terminology and determining who has the right to be offended, by whom, for what, that have partly enabled the right-wing backlash. This is a thorny issue when it comes to history. On the one hand, there are some topics that are going to be painful no matter how you talk about them. For example, slavery. That doesn't mean you don't talk about it. What it does mean is how you talk about it can heavily influence whether or not you're even being heard. Just yesterday, on Truth Social announced that we're focused too much on how bad slavery was. Every day is a gift. We decided early on at the Atlanta History Center that throwing around buzzwords like white privilege or even equity wasn't likely to encourage anyone or educate anyone who didn't already use their words themselves. Complaints over ideologically approved language often distract from the real issues we're trying to discuss. We aren't interested in handing a hammer to a group of people eager to pick apart our every word and then whack us over the head with no gain in actual understanding or learning. We're also careful to be precise in making, to use another buzzword, past-present connections. For example, we resisted calling Georgia's revised voting laws Jim Crow 2.0. Given the history of Jim Crow laws, we saw this as a lazy way of describing real problems in our current laws by comparing them to, and in the process trivializing, one of the most grave injustices in our nation's history. In another example, one of our staff members drafted an interpretive panel claiming that slavery is the direct cause of food insecurity in our present day. Maybe. But claims like this are gross oversimplifications of decades of history that have many complex causes and effects. We do ourselves a disservice by oversimplifying, overclaiming, and prematurely comparing present-day circumstances to historical injustices. It might sound snappy as a PR talking point, but what happens when the wolf actually comes to the door after calling everything a threat to democracy, the new Jim Crow, or the worst era in our history? What happens if we spend all of our time crying wolf and trying to label things instead of actually trying to figure out and reach out with those with whom we disagree? Now, that said, I do detect a wolfish smell these days, and I may have even spotted that wolf on my Ring camera. But I'm concerned that the threat won't be taken seriously because of the wolf crying we've heard over the last decade. It might seem like bringing this up now isn't particularly helpful in this precarious moment. Newton's third law of motion comes to mind here. Every action causes an equal and opposite reaction. In 2025 would update says that lately, every action causes an outsized and opposite reaction. It may seem that our cry for reasonableness or our desire to operate with reference to the state of Georgia's motto of wisdom, justice, moderation, I wish a lot of people did that in the state government, anyway, is an inadequate response. We hope that there are many people, though, who will become exhausted with this revolving outrage cycle. By continuing our approach, we are establishing a reputation for reasoned discussion that may become effective as our political climate evolves. That is where our approach to history as a history museum is relevant. We have the opportunity to harness history to set the table for a new way forward. Rather than swinging back and forth, we're seeking to chart a course that draws lessons and inspiration from the past in a way that can be received by as many people as possible and that makes room for multiple perspectives. The approach has to be productive, not punitive. For example, virtue signaling and shaming are not strategies, and neither is blatant prevarication. We approach history by showing our work and using plain English rather than resorting to shorthand to describe tricky concepts. It might not be punchy, but I'd like to say it's at least been partially effective. We produced a documentary 2 years ago called Monument, The Untold Story of Stone Mountain, on the Stone Mountain carving. It's been shown statewide and watched on YouTube by over 100,000 people. In it, we clearly show the carving's connection to the Ku Klux Klan and the efforts to uphold segregation following the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education ruling. Viewers were particularly surprised to learn that the carving was completed in 1972, not 1892, as one might expect, and that it was dedicated by Spiro Agnew. The CEO of the governor-appointed Stone Mountain Memorial Association even watched it with me and told me that it would be a reference point for a new museum at the basis of the mountain. Interestingly, the Sons of Confederate Veterans are suing over that very museum as we speak, with the claim that when it opens later this year, it likely won't show the, quote, positive values of the Confederacy. In other projects, we more fully explore the complications of Gone with the Wind and its author, as you heard at the beginning of this presentation, at the Margaret Mitchell House. We discuss Civil War memory through the cyclorama and are now expanding our Civil War exhibition to talk even more about the lead up to the war in the 1840s and 50s, the centrality of slavery and Reconstruction and its long tail. We are facing these issues straight on, but doing so in a way that seeks to create an environment where all sides of the conversation might have a chance of hearing what we have to say and at least becoming aware of a different perspective. We do all of this as the country is approaching a historic moment, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. It's a document that has inspired generations of Americans both by its promises and by our desires to live up to its promises. And now, 250 years later, we are once again debating the gap between promise and practice. We promote civic initiatives that focus on building an American future where we can all have a say in and be proud of, such as our nationwide initiative, Civic Season, led by history museums, which connects Juneteenth and the 4th of July for a period of historically formed civic engagement geared towards those 1830, what we call the Death Valley for museum visitors. It seems to us that the most American thing in the world is to say that Juneteenth partially fulfilled the promise of July 4, and we should continue to build on that promise today. Rather than shying away from this conversation, we are further emphasizing our guiding principles. It is absolutely critical that institutions like museums are able to connect with audiences from across the political, economic, and any other spectrum you like to call. As a populace, we are polarized. We're distrustful, and we are largely convinced that this other side is not only wrong, but they're actually bad people. Many people are also convinced that we live in a zero-sum world. In order for one group to make gains, someone else has to lose, or that people fit only into two categories, oppressor and oppressed. 20th century European history has shown us that these conditions are dangerous to the survival of a free and democratic society and ripe for the exploitation by demagogues of all stripes. We know our approach is not for everybody, but we continue to use history, artifacts, and stories to illuminate the antecedents of our present-day issues, showing our work as we go and being measured in how we communicate information. At this moment, we believe that understanding the roots, causes, and consequences of the American Civil War is vitally important. How does a democracy tear itself apart and put itself back together again? What fault lines remain? Who paid the price? What do those ripples mean for us today? To those whose reactions to question why we must talk about so-called negative topics, that gets to the very core of the study of history itself. When done correctly, the study of history illuminates the fault lines in our current moment. It also reveals facts that are uncomfortable. Some people are made uncomfortable by facts that they interpret as challenging their self-worth or causing them to feel that their position in society is threatened. I believe it's when the discussion of issues raise these emotions that it gets labeled as negative. American history isn't meant to be a story of perfection, of a shining city on a hill with no dark spots. First of all, that idea was proposed by a dreadfully boring Puritan, so we shouldn't be adopting his vision anyway. But more importantly, to say that history is a story of perfection or a continuous march towards progress is disingenuous or at worst deliberately obscuring the truth. But I do see American history as a story from which we can draw inspiration, lessons learned, and a desire to make the next 100, 250 years better than the last 250 that came before. I look to my home city, Atlanta, as a key voice of this conversation. Atlanta was at one time the industrial heart of the Confederacy, a major hub of the internal slave trade, and later the beating heart of the Civil Rights Movement. Atlanta has seen depopulation, repopulation, redlining, the rise of Jim Crow segregation, the founding of the Second Ku Klux Klan, the rise of the Black Mecca, the establishment of trailblazing, historically significant institutions of black higher education, and everything in between. Today, as throughout most of its history, Atlanta is a diverse city within the larger context of a politically and racially diverse state. Understanding a full and complete history forms the bedrock of our city's ability to have these tough conversations, form consensus, if not agreement, and make progress. But as a homegrown Atlanta promoter, I have to say that this approach is better than the alternatives, burying our heads in the sand, or bulldozing over others' needs and perspectives, depending on the day. It's a city that cannot be fully understood except in its full complexity. A city that can't be fully understood unless you understand how both Margaret Mitchell and W.B. Du Bois lived and worked and thrived there at the same time. The United States as a whole is the same. One thing we've definitely learned is have to be careful who you put on a plinth or an equestrian statue. Honest history told in plain English can help us process complexity and understand where we are today. Honest history must help us do that. And the only way we can assure that others have the opportunity to be receptive to that honest history is with our boots firmly planted on the ground, no mounting block or horses needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sheffield. Let me start with one that came in a little bit earlier. How on earth did you put together Margaret Mitchell and W.E.B. Du Bois? And if they met, how do you imagine that porch conversation unfolding?
Well, the counterfactual about if they met, what it looked like, that's why I'm looking for a really good playwright. Because I can't imagine you have this 4'11" woman, 5'8" Du Bois, and they're both pistols, and both highly intelligent, obviously, and very headstrong in their beliefs. And it would be so delicious. But the reason we came out about it is we were redoing our exhibit at the Margaret Mitchell House. And I started looking at it, and I read Gone with the Wind again. And then I think I'm the only person male my age has read it twice. In Atlanta, that is. Then I read Black Reconstruction right after it. And what I thought was, then I noticed the dates, 1935, 1936. And they were both in the same city. I said, this is crazy. So the more we looked into it, the more we found out that Walter White, the head of the NAACP, sent Selznick, who was doing the movie, a letter saying that his screenwriters should read Black Reconstruction. And we kept seeing this turn up over and over again. There was this intersection between her and him, but they never met. And so I just thought it was delicious, and so we put that through the exhibit at the Margaret Mitchell House, and Du Bois is there prominently.
Thank you for that. This questioner asks that surely you must have on your board or among your group of donors people who still embrace the lost cause narrative and are curious as to how you deal with that, and if you can give an example of encountering that kind of situation and how you addressed it.
Well, I think if they're doing it, they're hiding pretty well, their ideology. We've had some in the past. I can assure you. But right now, I don't think we do. And I haven't seen it materialize. We'll see once the new Civil War exhibit opens next year, and it's completely redone. We had a 30-year-old exhibit we just are in the process of redoing. But it's really more probably in the donor community that I see them than on the board. And so the way I deal with that is I just try to talk to them in ways that are not threatening to them, just factual, and try not to get into a big debate. And then I'm happy to cash their check.
This questioner asks, can you comment on the role of women, daughters and widows of the Confederacy, in the education of Southern children and monuments?
Well, as you know, one of the great things that came out of Reconstruction were the public schools. And both for white and blacks, it didn't exist in the South. And the Freedmen's Bureau started setting them up, and the states ended up taking them over. But yes, there were the role of women, in perpetuating the lost cause and coming up with the rationales, which are so crazy, for the lost cause. Women were on the forefront of that, and they were really good about getting these things into schools. And when people, growing up, like Margaret Mitchell didn't know that the Civil War had been lost by the South, allegedly, until she was 10. That's not unusual back then. And people didn't go out of the way to tell the real story. So I don't know if that answered the question, but yes, the women particularly were important in transmitting this memory of the Civil War.
Yesterday's New York Times had a headline, Trump says Smithsonian focuses too much on how bad slavery was. How would you advise Smithsonian leadership to respond?
They are my friends, and I'm sending them no emails. I might have to have a drop phone or something to talk to them in terms of advising them. It's really hard, and we've been watching this a long time. This group made by us that we've set up to, it has a civic season. It's made up of a bunch of history museums from around the country, and the biggest ones are on the executive committee, and they're the ones you'd expect: New York Historical Archives, Monticello, Wright Museum of Detroit. There are about 8 of them around History Miami, a lot of people. And so we've been talking about this a long time. In terms of how to advise them, keep your head down and try to be as specific as you can about the facts, and leave off extra, English on stuff. That would be the way to do it if you wanted to stay, right? If you don't want to stay, you can leave and go do what you want. The great thing about Atlanta History Center, well, the bad thing is we never got any federal money. But the good thing is we never got any federal money. And we're able to survive. So, I think there's going to be an exodus of talent, and I'm waiting. I'd say be careful, don't tweet, and stay off of social media.
We have a couple of questions around contextualizing and interpreting Confederate iconography and monuments. One asks, what do you believe is an appropriate and culturally sensitive way forward for Stone Mountain Park? And the other asks for your thoughts about the removal of statues, for example, on Richmond's Monument Avenue.
Thank you for such a nice softball question. Stone Mountain we've been working on it with a long time. I started after Charlottesville. We started our monuments interpretation guide in January of 2016. At the same time, I went out and did an outline of the history of Stone Mountain. And that's all you have to know how fraught it is. Just look at the outline. You don't have to have anything to explain it. The steps are all there. And I got that, so I tried to get it to the governor of the state through his lawyer to say, hey, you're in the second term. Maybe you could do something about this. And I think the initial thing that should happen is that they should take the designation of the entire 2,000-acre park as a Confederate monument out of the statutes. To me, that would detoxify it a lot. That all of a sudden, all these people that are going there every day, and I would say they look more like the United Nations than they look like a country club in Atlanta, and join the park, why are they on a Confederate memorial? What is the rationale for that? All you have to do is change a few things in the code. I've drafted some language, and we've had it introduced. It's not going anywhere. That would be the first thing. The second thing is I talked about the museum at the base of the mountain. I mean, there aren't any other Confederate monuments that I know of or memorials that have an actually museum at the bottom. Now, this one historically whitewashed everything. You had one little square picture about the dark days of the Ku Klux Klan on a whole collage wall. They're now, I think, because I haven't seen it, they asked me if I wanted to be on the team. I said, hell no, because there's no winning with that. It's a state thing. But if they do tell the truth, that to me goes a long way in dealing with the issue. Now, the Sons of Confederate Veterans are suing, and the Georgia Attorney General, who's running for governor, is defending the state, and that's really interesting, and saying that they don't have a standing to sue because of sovereign immunity by the state. So, Stone Mountain Memorial, it was started by the Klan, and then it went basically in 1928 stalled during, right at the time of the Depression. 57 days after Brown versus Board of Education, Marvin Griffin, who was running for governor, who won, made it a pledge to buy the mountain and restart the carving. And the craziness of that carving being recarved all during the 1960s. You have Selma here, and you have this the horse being finished with Stonewall Jackson. It's all in the paper, all at the same time. It's crazy. But for me, that would probably do it. I don't think that people have talked about blowing it off the mountain. That's just not going to happen. And I think it's super divisive. And we can see maybe this other work. Maybe in 20 years, they can look at that a different way. But for now, it's the greatest exhibit of Jim Crow America that's out there. It's certainly the largest. And that's the way I look at it. Now, other monuments, when we came up with this Confederate Monument Interpretation Guide, our strategy was nobody in Georgia or anywhere else in the South wants somebody from Atlanta telling them what to do, right? So what we did was put together a toolkit for each community so a local troublemaker can learn how to contextualize their monument. And all we said was, we believe the only ethical thing to do is to either fully contextualize it or remove it. But we're not saying for your community, what you need, because nobody wants to hear that anyway. But that was our strategy, and we've done a lot of work with that with communities around the South. It's been very interesting. I got a call, for example, from somebody in Portland, Oregon, a history professor out there, about contextualizing their monuments. I'm like, what the hell are you got? And she was talking about they have all kinds of things out there. And then I said, by the way, could you, and she said, what can I do for you? I said, well, could you call all your friends back who are now in Atlanta protesting the police training center? Could you please get to blow your horn and have your ram's horn and have them come back to Portland? She goes, funny you should mention that. One of my students and her father just went to Atlanta to protest. I said, of course they did. So it's been really interesting that way. The other one that was interesting was the person who headed the History Museum in Chicago called me and asked me about the same thing. I said, what the hell is your problem? He says, we've got Philip Sheridan's statue there, and he was reputed to have said, probably didn't say it, but probably felt it, that the only good Indian was a dead Indian. And so they're dealing with that issue of that very, distinguished Northern general who destroyed the entire valley in Virginia and said it was going to make sure the Shenandoah Valley was so clean that a crow had to fly across it with its own bag of corn itself. So I said, you go at it with them. I said, really, that's fine with me. They take that down. But I'm not sure what they've done. But I said the same thing. Either they have to contextualize it or remove it. And I'm not sure where that's gone. But it's all around the country. And I also was on a panel in Boston when they were talking about the Boston Public Garden and the statue about that had Lincoln and the enslaved person, rising, and he was down low, and it was deemed, even though it was done by an African-American sculptor and it was paid for by African-Americans, the original one in Washington, D.C., it felt like it was demeaning. And so they had me on a panel, and I was the diversity on the panel. And apparently it was the most integrated meeting they've ever seen in Boston that night, because it's a very segregated city. And what they at the end, they go, we're going to do a lightning round. I'm like, uh-oh. Keep it or remove it. And so it went, remove it, remove it, remove it. And then I was the last one. I said, well, all I know is that nobody in Boston wants anybody from Atlanta telling them what to do. And that diffused and I escaped. But it's interesting. It's everywhere.
We have so many questions for you, but unfortunately we're running out of time and people need to get to their next appointment. So I have one last question for you, Sheffield. And that is, do you have a similar story of two opposing views of the South in Atlanta during the 1960s or 1970s when the Civil Rights Movement was underway?
Well, yes. You're talking about people or, well, we had Martin Luther King. We also had Ivan Allen, who was a great leader. And of course, we had some people in the Ku Klux Klan that were out there messing around. But yeah, we had at Atlanta, the whole business about Atlanta, too busy to hate. I call it babbitry over bigotry. But that was sort of a thing, and it was the way the white power structure was working with the black power structure. And then after Maynard Jackson came in as mayor, it sort of flipped around because the white power structure no longer included the city government, and it made everybody behave better. So that's all I can say about that. It was a very interesting time for Atlanta. Atlanta shone. It wasn't perfect, but it's so wonderful to have Birmingham next door. Makes us look so good every time. And and Martin Luther King was pretty careful to keep a lot of the protests out of Atlanta, his hometown, in respect for his father. The people at SNCC, however, got him to get involved with the sit-ins at Rich's store, and then got Martin Luther King finally arrested there. But he didn't drive that. The students forced him there. And so that's a really interesting story in itself.
Sheffield Hale, thank you for your deep and thoughtful work on history and how we can harness it. And thank all of you for your time today. It's been a great season, and we appreciate all your involvement.